Start recording. Hello everyone and welcome to Handmade Hero, the show where we code a complete game live on stream. We did, well, I guess we did much of the work yesterday, but not quite all of the work necessary to start having the concept of separate layers for our rendering in terms of Z, so that we actually have specific layers of graphics that operate in Z, and then we've got sort of a separate Z that's used inside those layers to do Y displacement. And this is relatively important for a number of reasons, because due to the 2.5D nature of this game, or maybe, I don't know what you would call it, the 2.2D, we're basically a 2D game, but we do have this concept that rooms can be stacked on top of other rooms, and you can see those other rooms by looking through holes in the floor or otherwise. So given that fact, the question is, how do we present this in a reasonable way to the viewer? And what we found on Handmade Hero is we kind of wanted there to be a Z which is just Y based, so it just kind of moves things higher or lower on the screen based on Z, for kind of a standard orthographic Z feel. But then having a sort of scaling effect was very nice for rooms above other rooms or rooms below other rooms to kind of give that nice feeling of depth. And so we wanted both of those, and that means that we have to have this notion that there are sort of two kinds of Z values, one that creates that scaling effect and one that just is a Y displacement. And so we never really got that nailed down. And so here in our sort of waning time, when we're winding down sort of engine-y features and transitioning into gamey things, it's important for this, I think, to be nailed down. So we did some of that, and today we need to kind of finalize some of those decisions, or at least try to get as far as we can towards finalizing how we specify Z down to the rendering system. All right, so today, in case you missed it, is day 298. So if you want to follow along at home, unpack day 297 source code into a directory somewhere, and that's what I'm starting with at the moment, as they say. They don't probably actually say that. All right, so let's see where we were at the end of yesterday's stream, in case you don't remember where we left off. What we did is we actually put in all the code for doing those slices, and we just haven't actually worked with the Z yet. And so what's happening right now, and what's kind of very confusing actually, and you can sort of see this happening directly here, if you'll notice, we only put one Monstar and one snake in each room. That's what the startup code was programmed to do. And yet you see two snakes and two Monstars, as well as a weird split stairwell. So what's going on here? Well, what's going on here is at the end of yesterday's stream, we had just finished the code which splits tiles into layers and then assigns splits tiles, splits entities into layers and then assigns them their Z within that layer as the Z they send to the renderer. And what you can see happening right now is exactly that sort of flattening down to a single layer that's happening because of that, since we have nowhere to put the layer part of the Z that we extracted, right? So what you're actually looking at right here is the first floor of the game that our little test generator generated, and the second floor that's stacked on top of it, both drawn on top of each other in the same place. Hence two snakes and two Monstars, right? You can also see that the snake and the Monstar, one of the sets of those is highlighting the tiles and the other isn't, and that's because those tiles that the other snake and Monstar are on are being drawn underneath, right? This set of tiles. They're right on top of each other, but underneath, as two different layers, because someone's going to win that fight, right? And so the ones that they're stepping on are getting highlighted underneath, but you can't see them because they're getting covered up immediately, right? So that's what you're seeing. You're seeing that kind of smush. So our job today is to sort of continue forward with this and start actually doing those assignments and clean up the renderer path so that it understands the difference between a layer Z, which will be something specified separately, and the regular z value, which will always be used for y displacement, and which isn't getting used for y displacement at the moment. And again, this is, of course, trickier than you might think because it is inherently a non-systemic concept. You know, I'm a 3D graphics programmer, if I'm a graphics programmer at all, and so I'm very used to dealing with things in 3D. It's always a little bit challenging to then go down to 2D because we're faced with all these weird decisions and weird kind of pipeline cases of, instead of everything just being handled in a uniform 3D environment, we've kind of got this weird thing. It's like, oh, well, we want Z to mean this sometimes and this some other times. So it's kind of this gradual winnowing process of trying to get things to flow down the pipeline in a way that preserves the information that is necessary while not saving more information that is necessary and blah, 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 blah. So let's go ahead and start taking a look at that. Like I said, it is a little more challenging than you might think, simply because we can't just go to an established math book or an established standard and go, here is how we represent these things. We have to make it up as we go along and get something that will be appropriate for our game in our circumstance. So I'm going to go ahead and go to the Handmade render group here. And you can see as I look at this, we can kind of take a look at what's happening in the current Z state. We know that we set up perspective or orthographic transforms. We know that we call getRenderEntityBasis P, and that is what does our Z work here. And you can see already there's some shenanigans happening in here, right? Where we've got our X and Y, and those are kind of coming through in a specific way that the Z does not, right? And you can see that the offset P, which is a separate thing, does get added in there from the object transform in a way that does preserve the Z, and then the P comes through in a particular way, blah, 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 right? So you can definitely see that there's a lot of jankiness to this transform, right? There's a lot of like kind of special purposes to transform. And so our job here is just to try and streamline this as much as possible and try to make it coherent what is going to go on with Z here. And as you can see from, you know, this straight line through the code, nowhere do we actually put Z into X or Y. What we do instead is use a regular perspective modification to actually just do the correct XY displacement. So we never have a manual assignment of Z to X or Y, even though what we want to do now is have a manual transfer of the Z of something to be in that excuse me. We want sort of that XYZ. We want to make sure that works the way we would expect. Now, we do have one overwhelmingly, I guess, one overriding concern. And it's something that I'm not exactly sure how we're going to handle. It's the one part that's kind of a little bit like, well, I'm not sure what to do with this, right? And that is the one time we actually care about the difference between these two ways of handling Z. And to, I guess, put a sort of phrase on it, it's the changeover point. So what you can sort of, if you can envision it, right? We have a situation where we've got, we've got slices in the game that want to be doing their sort of 3D transform. And we've got these situations where I can like have a floor and I can see down to potentially something on the lower floor, right? Now, I'm assuming that what we want to do is to try and enable stuff like somebody who might hop from one thing down to another one. We want to make that be something that is, possible or plausible, right? And we need some way of drawing it. And the problem that we have is that if down in here, you've got this situation where things on the lower level are scaled differently, right, than things on the upper level, at some point, we need to linearly interpolate between those two scalings, right? And because if we don't, it'll just pop, right? As this thing jumps, it'll go from being that size to being that size instantaneously. Whereas what we would much rather it do is to scale down more gradually, or at least it have some kind of a smoothing period that would make it less jarring. Now, if you remember, what we're sort of saying, if we look at this from the side, right? So I'm going to tilt these like this, so we can kind of see both of them in a perspective-y kind of way. Right? So if I've got an object like this, and it's going to pass through here, then what I'm saying is that somewhere in between these regions, scaling must occur, right? For this thing to get smaller, if it happens to be drawn at this size down here and this size up here, right? So there's got to be some kind of a transition region below the floor, I guess, or something like that, that is where that scaling occurs. Now, furthermore, there has to be some area where the scaling wouldn't occur. And the reason that that has to be true is because if we want displacement by z to just yield a y displacement, then what we're going to see on the screen, if something is supposed to be floating upwards and then downwards again, is just a little bit of an upward motion and then a little bit of a downward motion. And it's not going to change scale, right? It's not going to get bigger or smaller. So, that is the problem that we're facing. And I suspect, although I do not know, that the most straightforward way to handle it would be to do almost exactly what I have drawn here, and really don't try to be any fancier, and see if that's enough, right? And that is to say that there is going to be a certain definition of what the floor height is. Right now we've got a parameter called typical floor height, and we'll probably change that to just be called floor height, because that's how big one sort of slice is. And what we will do is we'll take the top part of this and we'll assign this top part to be the scaling region, and then we'll assign this part here, instead of this being scaling, we'll assign this here to be the displacement region. And so when we look at a z, we know that if it's in here, it's going to have its scaling interpolated, right? And its position. And so in this region, it's actually changing its z, right? And in this region, it's not. Another way to look at this, right, would be to say that there is there is the actual world space z transition between these two things. This is the full floor height. And if we were to just pump z through normally, we would get that full sizing and displacement that we were getting before, that we said we need to get rid of inside a single floor. What we effectively want to do is map this entire height of z displacement into a much smaller region, right? So that what we will do is we'll hand the renderer z values for scaling and xy sort of standard z changes. We'll hand it a much wider varying z than it would be normally warranted in this area, and then we'll lock the z and not vary it in here, and instead use some kind of y displacement there, right? So that's what we want to do. Like I said, it's a little tricky to get right, and we have to make decisions about who is making these determinations and when. So it's a little bit of a tough one. But that's what we have to do. Okay. So at the same time, I think we want to be cognizant of one other issue that we have, and that we need to keep under control, I guess is what I would say. And that is that we have a sort of a notion of blocks that you are going to be on. And we haven't talked too much about this because we'll probably wait to sort of do this fully until we've got an art pack in place, which we'll probably send out at some point over the next month or two. We have a sort of situation where we're going to have like blocky pieces, because like I said, you're going to have these things that you jump on, and they could be displaced in z, right? And we've got sort of an emulation, or not an emulation, a sort of simple version of this here. You can even see it happening like here. We have a problem with this, which is that even after we get z-slice stuff correct, you're still going to have this concept of the floor kind of fighting with characters to know who to sort. And as humans, we always know who to sort because it makes sort of concrete sense to us how we might do that, right? We kind of know that, well, let's suppose that in this situation, I have a character standing up on this sort of pillar here, right? And I'm going to kind of draw a little shading here so you can kind of see what I'm talking about, right? If there was a sort of a tower, if you will, right in front of this guy that extended all the way up here, right? And this tower was like obviously in front of this person, we know because that thing is closer to us, we know that it would draw in front of these people, right? So all of this stuff is all in front of this guy right here, right? But on the other hand, if there was a tower like that was behind him, right? Even if it was the same height, right? Exactly the same height, it would be behind him. Yeah? And that's again because we sort of have this notion of of where things are in the y of the world, as well as where things are in the z of the world, and we're only sorting by the y, right? And not only are we only sorting by the y, but we're sorting by the y in a really, really weird way, which says that like the thing that I'm standing on here, is underneath me at certain times, and it would be in front of me at other times, because even though its y is technically in front of me or behind me or whatever, I know that it's a tile that I'm standing on, and blah, blah, blah. So we need to have some coherent system on how these are sorted, and my suspicion is we're going to basically need to do this with some kind of a hot point rule. Which is to say that I think we want something where we can strictly sort by a real value. Like we probably want to do like sort by, y then z, or something like this, right? We want something very straightforward like that. And so what I think we're going to have to do, because, right now we got a hack in there that does like, is this tile upright or is it flat? I don't think that's going to last. I don't think that will actually work, right? So I think what we need to do is we need to start doing something where whatever the points are that we're sorting, they're placed to make sure that they will produce the correct results in all cases. So for example, what I think we need to do is we were previously taking tiles and we were saying that their center point, right, was the y value that they were getting sorted on. Now that's a problem because what that means is as soon as the hero is here, right? If this is the basis point for the hero, he's now behind the tile and the tile will draw in front of him. Whereas if he's here, he is in front of the tile and he'll draw in front of it as he should. So I think the answer to this, rather than setting the thing to be upright, I think what we want to do instead is say, let's always make the rule that we set the y placement for sorting. Like we could even have a special point for sorting that bitmaps have. The y placement for sorting for a bitmap for a tile, we could just place the y back here, because then that's always correct, right? If this is the placement for the y, then anything behind this placement will be drawn properly behind it, which is what we want if this thing can get below it, right? Now, there's a slight caveat there, which is when something moves behind something else, it doesn't do so on a strictly point basis, right? So we probably need to say that the point for sorting for this guy maybe is even further back than that. I don't know. Because there's sort of the concept still that shadows have to be placed on here and that sort of stuff. So, that if we use a strict Y sorting system, we would definitely be able to make points sort properly. But things with size are not as easy, right? They're still a little trickier. And so that question, unfortunately, is not one that I really know. I don't know what the I don't know what the easy answer is to it, right? I don't know what we would do specifically for that. Because sometimes, like I said, the hero would be behind this floor, right? And the example there is, suppose we were looking from the side, and the hero is standing here. If we are viewing that from this direction, right, then clearly this tile should sort in front of the hero, right? We would not want to see the hero because all this stuff should be blocking him. So this part should all be blocked. However, take the exact same circumstance, the exact same one, and it looks like this. So all I've done is move this tile and put it down. So exact same circumstance, and all I did was lower this tile. Well, now when I look at this tile probably should not appear in front of the hero, and the reason for that is if there was a shadow blob here, that shadow blob would get clipped by this tile, which is not what we want. We want the shadow blob to appear on the tile, right? And that's true for any part of the hero that extends past the sort point for him as well. Now, if we cheat this and say, well, okay, Casey, you probably can get away with adjusting the sort point on the hero as well. So let's say that it's got sort of this shadow blob or you know, the feet are like this or whatever. Instead of placing the point for sorting there, you know, maybe you place the point for sorting here. Well, if you place the point for sorting here, then you have the problem where this now will show the hero in front of this tile, right? Because the fact that this point for sorting is moved up to the front means that I can't actually count on it to do the right sort here. So you can see why this is a really big problem. And I don't really know what the most effective way is to solve it. I think what we, you know, it's plausible that the most stable solution, and I don't know if this is true or not because I haven't thought about it for very long, but it's plausible that we might get some mileage out of actually using the 3D-ness of the scene to help us. And I'm not sure one way or the other if that's an improvement or not. But obviously, you know, the sort of the fact that we can take a look at when we're actually looking down at this thing, the fact that we know where these things occur relative to the view direction in actual 3D might help us. I don't know if it will or if it won't, but it's possible that's something we need to take into account. The other thing we can do here is we might be able to do something where we use, again, some sort of a z-biasing. You know, maybe the upright thing that we were using before, maybe we can still use that for handling the shadow case. I don't really know, but yeah. So this is a really nasty problem. Like I said, I don't feel like I have a really great solution to it. It's the kind of thing we don't super have to deal with a whole lot in real 3D because, you know, this is something that you can use the actual geometry to sort of figure out. Although, sometimes you do get nasty stuff like this when you're trying to do relatively precise things or shadow buffers or those sorts of things where you end up actually having some nasty cases where you're trying to figure out what's in front of what and it's not as straightforward as it might seem. But on the whole, we don't have to deal with this sort of thing where there's a conceptual sort that we know that we want and we have to figure out how to get that conceptual sort. Yeah, it's a little bit tricky. So, I don't have a solid solution for this. All I know is that we are definitely going to have to address it, and it's something that the renderer has to be aware of. Or perhaps not really that aware of, and it's just something that we use sort keys for on the client side, but yeah, I mean on the, you know, not client side, but on the user's side of the renderer. And we can just say, well, you know, it's going to produce sort keys that magically make this thing work. But no matter where we push that problem to, ultimately, since I'm the only programmer, you know, we're going to have to deal with it. Unfortunately, we can't just pass the buck. So, And now I think about it, since I'm drawing these cases out here, I wonder if we should spend a second thinking, is there anything smarter to do before I go typing? Maybe there is some kind of an insight we can gain here. I mean, what's the difference really between these cases that makes it true, right? So what we're doing effectively is we're saying that there's sort of this variability that comes in, whereas as I lower this thing down, as soon as I reach a z value that's lower, right, than here, I want to draw the stuff on top of it still. And there's sort of this notion that the z value is the thing that determines whether something goes on top. And stated sort of a little bit alternately, right? If this thing is above the z level of the hero, we would not draw the shadow on it, and if it's below the z level of the hero, we would, right? So what's interesting about that is, in the case of the shadow, it's really just the z value that determines the sort order of the shadow against pretty much anything in the scene, I guess everywhere. Because since we know that these things are all on the same plane, they're all in the same, they're not tilted, right? And so it's sort of like you have this notion of z-planar sorting, and anything that's in that sort of screen plane, whatever the z value of it determines who draws first. And then I guess the other people, their y value determines who draws first. So I think that does sort of suggest that the concept of whether something is upright or not, does sort of seem to be a lot about which one of those two kinds of bitmaps you are, does seem to have a big implication for how you're supposed to be rendered, right? So let's think of a few more cases here. So let's suppose that I've got this situation. So I have hero, and hero is standing on something back here, and then something up here is obviously shadowing, not shadowing, but occluding the hero. So you can't see the hero because there's a giant column in the way, right? So how do I know to sort the hero behind this column, right? Well, the z value would tell me that, but if I had an equivalent column here, its z value would also sort in front of the hero, and obviously that's not true, right? Obviously the hero should not be drawn in front of this, but it should be drawn in front of this. And so here we have the y value telling us what gets drawn in front of what, right? So the y value does give us that piece of information, right? And it seems as though in this case, when we're trying to decide how to draw the hero, when we're trying to determine the sort order of these things, we want them to draw in y order, but when we are trying to draw the hero relative to one of these, right, this is where we actually start to care about the z. So once the z value comes down below the z value of the hero, we now want to pessimize this. So it looks to me kind of like what you would say is you sort in Y, and then the Z, if you were already less than whatever the thing was in Y, then your Z value determines whether you will sort in front of or behind. If you aren't, right? So if I compare two people, if I compare two render instructions, I would say, well, when I compare these two, if one has a Y value that is greater than, well, you know what? This is not Y. This is actually Y. Because I think I was saying the camera was looking here, right? So Y goes up the screen. And perhaps more accurately, this is the camera. But yeah. So if I'm looking at this, I would say, well, if something has a lesser Y value than, if we have A and B, right? Maybe this is A and this is B. If A has a lesser Y value than B, then it's going to be drawn first. Unless it has a lower Z value, right? So that, unfortunately, seems to still give... Because that, I mean, if I phrase it that way exactly, then that just means you sort by Z first and then Y, right? I mean, that's what that would do. And if we did that, then we have that same problem of this thing, isn't that going to sort this thing wrong? Because I look at these two things and I say, well, no, but I guess his Z value is still less. So that seems fine too. So I'm trying to think of cases where that doesn't work. Sorting by Z and then by Y. Because it seems like that still would work, even in this case, because as this thing gets lower, right? Right, if I sort by Z first, if I sort by Z first, then this guy would draw second in these cases. So that's why this doesn't work. I already enumerated this case, right? So my brain is really slow today. So if we're looking at this guy, we'd say, well, his Z is higher, so he'd sort in front of this guy, which is not correct. He needs to sort behind him because of the Y, right? So we have this problem of the Y sort still needs to be effectual, and we just have a couple cases in where we would need to look at Z to say we want to override that behavior so that we don't accidentally sort incorrectly in this case, right? And I'm really just not sure how to make that happen without causing other cases to be wrong. Because it seems like, either one we pick, that's obviously not going to be right. But if we do Y then Z, which does everything correct most of the time, we then end up with this problem of, we end up with this problem for trying to have shadows fall on other things and stuff like that. So if we were going to try and fix that, How would we do it? You know? What would I do that would make that work? And I don't know. I guess one way to do it would be to make shadows be something that were handled a little bit separately. So like things that are transparent like that, like ground shadows, would maybe just have to be handled separately. So you just wouldn't ever have that case. You would always handle shadows as things that fell onto specific bitmaps, and maybe that's a smarter way to have that work. So there isn't one shadow for the hero. There's one shadow for the hero for every tile, and it's adjusted per tile so that we know that it's going to be sorted correctly onto that tile. I could see that being reasonable. Similarly, we could ask the question, how do we know that the hero sorts above the tile, right? Right, because the tile and the hero would both be at the same kind of point to a certain degree. But I think that could probably be handled by the fact that these would have higher z values now. So these would all sort in the same y effectively, but the z would be the thing that would tell you that. And well, or the other thing would be placing the sort point back further. So let's suppose that what we did was we placed, for things that are flat, we placed the sort point at the back. And for things that are standing upright, we place them at the base, right? That would appear to always work properly if you take out shadowing, right? If you take shadowing out of the equation, I feel like that works correctly. Because now you are always going to sort these in front of these if they're on top of each other. But once it moves behind, it will sort behind it as it should. Right? And that might be workable. That might be workable. And then you really, like I said, you only have one thing to do at that point. You just have to sort by the y, and then inside y, I don't know if you have to sort any more than that, but you probably want to sort by z after that just in case, right? So like with the hero, where it's stacked on top of each other, you want the higher things to be drawn first, typically. But that could also just be a fudge value that we use, because typically that's going to be more subject to just whatever we want, since that you don't really move in z to occlude very often. I think I'm pretty happy with that. I think that's all right. But again, what this requires is that the sort key is computed in a very specific way. It requires the sort key to be computed separate from what might be like the pivot point of an object, or something that relates to its placement in the world. We need a sort of separate notion of here is the sort handle, and that sort handle is placed, very specifically. But that doesn't seem too onerous. I'm trying to think if there are any problems with that. And that would also get us out of the business of specifying whether something's upright or not, because it's basically just whatever you set up initially as that sort point is what would determine whether the thing sorts in a way that's similar to the upright versions or similar to the lying flat versions. Yeah. So let's take a look in our code here. Since I kind of got off on this tangent of fixing that problem, I kind of want to take a look here at what's going on with that as well. So in here, when I do a where I do a push bitmap call, in here you can pass the sort key through, can't you? Or at least you could before. well, it's computed by the render basis. Excuse me. So when you do a push render element, you do pass in whatever the sort key is that you actually wanted to use. And so what I could do is I could make that so that when we do a push bitmap call, we sort of compute that sort key here based on what I just said. So the inputs to this system could be that. And I don't see, so the C-align value, I'm curious to know where we use the C-align value. I think we use the C-align value mostly for debugging purposes, right? We use that so that if we want to show a bitmap, it doesn't get displaced by anything. I think that's really the only thing we do there. And I'm not sure that that was the most efficient way to do that, but that's, yeah, that's how that happened. So the question is here, all right, if we wanted to make this be more explicit on the sort key stuff, we would have to sort of pass a sort key through here in some way. And this basis sort key stuff, of course, is also problematic because presumably there's information in there that we wouldn't know else otherwise, right? Like, for example, meters to pixels affects this from the camera transform. Although in theory, if everything's being multiplied by meters to pixels, then it doesn't really matter. This is going to be real tricky. This is going to be real tricky to get right. All right, well, anyway, so if we want to take a look at this, what we need to do is say, well, there would be a secondary point passed in here, really. And the secondary point is the one that's actually used for sorting, if that makes sense. And so we kind of need to transform, you know, to do like two transforms. One to transform the point that we're actually using, and one to do the transform for whatever that sort point is. Now, since we have the concept of a scaling value, we should, though, we could probably fake this by saying after you perform this transform, if the sort, the part where we're passing down the sort, if that's just expressed as a delta, right? Because that's all it's ever going to be. It's just a delta off of the actual point that we're projecting. We need some way of applying that delta after the fact, and the scale value kind of gives us that ability, right? So what we could do is say, well, you know, whatever the sort key is would be something like a displacement, and we know that the displacement in X doesn't matter, so we really just have a sort bias at the end of the day, right? There's really just a sort bias. And the problem is that before when we were applying this sort bias, we aren't scaling the sort bias by the scale that comes in here. But if we were to start scaling the sort bias, then that would fix the problem. So if we scaled by the sort bias and placed those biases so that they were at the tops and bottoms of bitmaps in Y, this would then presumably work. Similarly, we could then say, well, this whole nonsense here with the original PZ and the 2 times PZ and the blah, 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 right? That stuff should also be able to be handled directly now, where we could say, well, object transform upright is not necessary anymore, right? We know that Y is being sorted on as sort of a separate entity, but here, I guess, and this is a little bit weird, it looks like we're sorting by Z. It looks like we're sorting by Z much more strenuously than by Y, which is the opposite, I think, of what I said should happen. So that's a little bit tricky. I think that may have been a slight mistake. I don't think that's what we wanted. But I'm going to name these things a little bit cleaner here. So we have two things. we have the layer Z, or the perspective Z, you might say. And we have the displacement Z. Right? And we're going to have to know what those are. And so when we do our transform here, those two Z values are going to be used in a different way. So our perspective Z is definitely, is the one that is the most important sort value. Because if you have another layer, that layer is definitely going to cause the sorting to be predominant, right? So that's always the case, that if you're on a particular layer, you have to have that as your most important sort criteria. So that's true. But then, in addition to that, we have the matter of the actual Z values here. Where we've got the displacement Z, and then we've got the PY value. So the PY value is what we're saying has to be dominant over the displacement Z. So that is going to have to be, again, another sort of power up. And then the displacement Z is the final bit of information there that we have, where we're trying to figure out how this would be factored in. And I think the higher that Z, the higher up you want to sort, right? So I think this is close to what we said we wanted to do on the blackboard. But, like I said, we have a slight problem here, which is to say that the Y value that we're using in the sorting wants to be adjusted by the fact that we may displace it from the center of the bitmap or wherever else, right? So the sort bias, I would say, in here is a modifier on the Y value. So I think that is perhaps the more correct full transform. So I would say there's basically the perspective sort term, and that's this. There's the Y sort term, and that's this. And then there's the Z sort term, and that's this. And so our final equation is just the perspective times the sort, the Y, plus the Y plus the Z. So I think that's what we want. And this particular piece of information here, where we have that sort bias, so it's not really quote unquote a sort bias anymore, but whatever. We can rename that easily. So the point is, we have this other piece of information here, and that's what we would use to displace the sort properly. But now the question is, well, we've actually got to get these other values from somewhere, and that's easier said than done, certainly, right? And so when we find ourselves in this routine with sort of an object transform coming through, and then a displacement transform and that kind of stuff, what we have is we were sort of cheating here by saying, well, we had an original P, and we sort of stole the, since we had two separate things we were specifying, an object transform and then an offset off of that object transform, we kind of cheated and said, well, one of the Z's will be a displacement Z and one of the Z's won't. But that caused a lot of problems, and it's just not very clear. So I think what we want to do instead is pass the layer Z separately, right? And we're just going to have to extend our notion of what that means, and just make that work. We're going to have that in addition. which means we probably will have to say, well, the original P is maybe now a V4. It's X, Y, displacement Z, layer Z, or something like that, right? That may be the most straightforward thing to do. So then when we say that we've got a V3P here, we would no longer be doing this sort of thing. Instead, we would treat these as the same and produce our perspective P from the actual XYZ, and then there's sort of that displacement Z that's additional on the end, right? Now, again, that's still a little bit confusing because it's unclear which you would want to do. Do you want the third? You've got 4 elements in a vector. If we were doing a V4, do we want the third element or the fourth element? Or I should say the third, the 2th or the third? Which of these do we want to be the one that does perspective, and which of these do we want to be the one that does displacement? Now, I'm going to go against what might be the most intuitive thing to do here, simply because I feel like the way I would remember it better, even though it's less intuitive, is to put displacement on the affine part, because I think of affine as displacement, and put the perspective on the Z part, because that's what I tend to think of as Z. So we would create the P that we're going to use in this fashion, and then all the other things that are going to happen here will happen here. And then at the end, we would say, well, okay, so now we know what our perspective Z is. Our perspective Z is just whatever we actually output it as the Z value, right? So whatever we actually transformed through as our Z is what our Z would be. And our displacement Z really is just a value that gets scaled by whatever the projected Z is, but then is just treated as a normal value, right? So whatever this result scale is here, that result scale is going to be the thing, excuse me, and I guess that produces, honestly, that's going to produce this, this term here. So the Z sort term is really going to be, well, we've already got it set up to do this, but anyway, point being, we've got the result scale. We're going to multiply that by whatever the displacement Z is. So we would just say displacement Z, or yeah, it's the unscaled, I guess I'll do this way. PW, since it's the W coordinate, is going to be that part. So we're kind of breaking it into 2 parts for purposes of this. So if we scale the resulting value by whatever we would have scaled for the transform, we'll get the displacement Z out of it. Then we have our perspective sort terms, like so. I'm sorry, our sort key made up the perspective term, the Y term, the Z sort term. And I think that's really all there is to that, right? And so now we don't need this. I'm sorry. I just realized I did this slightly wrong. No, I did. Never mind. So now we still need to pass in the object transform what that sort bias is, which I don't know if that's the most intelligent place to put that, right? Because it's something that varies per actual bitmap, right? So when you pass through this original P, you kind of want to pass through what you want that displacement for sorting to be, that Y displacement for sorting to be. And I mean, like I said, I could make it so that that's actually the P value that actually gets used always. And then you wouldn't have this, right? Because we could just say, well, you're always supposed to pass the actual value down, right? You're just supposed to place that Y value at the correct location, and the bitmap should always be centered around it properly. And I can't say that I disagree with that, right? And that seems a little bit better potentially because that way the sort bias stays an actual regular bias that, you know, and we just assume that the hotspot of the bitmap is just placed at the sort location. That I don't really have a strong opinion about either way. I really can't say that there's anything, yeah. I really can't say that makes me care specifically much about that in a real way. I feel like the risk there is that we have two concepts of important points on a bitmap. One is the one that's used for alignment, and that would be important in terms of rotation and scaling. And the other one is important in terms of sorting. Now I'm trying to think to what degree those tend to line up. I mean, here's some other things to think about. Suppose I have a multi-segment body. And these are like a jointed, this is like a jointed figure, which we already kind of have, right? And are only going to have more of. If I want to rotate this about this point, then it makes sense for that to kind of be the alignment point for the bitmap, and I'm going to do that sort of rotation. That's all pretty clear, and that's all good. However, this whole thing pretty much wants to be sorted as one entity, right? We want all of these bitmaps to be sorted based on this point. And then inside of this, all of these things would then be sorted kind of just relative to each other in a predefined way, right? We know whether, you know, what the sort of composite order is. It's whatever the artist wanted it to be. And it really doesn't have anything to do with these points, right? They're not important. So it seems to me that that suggests that the sort point actually comes out of a completely different place, right? So in other words, when we come through here and we do perspective Z, displacement Z, and all this sort of stuff, the sort value is actually going to be something that got computed along with in a separate way, right? It's something that you did, you know, you did like sort key, and you know, you passed that, right? You got one of these back, whatever it was, and when you got it back, you set it as part of like the object transform and just used it for all the pieces of this thing, whatever this thing is. Right? That to me seems like what would probably happen, because most articulated figures are going to need to set the sort key once and have all of their components sorted with that key, and then each of the things on that key would be assigned a specific location relative to each other. Yeah, I feel like that is definitely what has to happen. All right, so I'm gonna play with this a little bit here. I guess I should, since we're at the end of the day, I should back this out for the time being. Projected xy dot z. So the perspective z term there, do I want that scaled? I guess since everyone else is scaled. I'm not sure. I mean, it sort of seems like that's just this. This is going to wreak havoc. But what are you going to do? So anyway. So yeah, I think that's what we probably want to get to. And I feel like starting next week, maybe the right thing to do here is come into world mode where now we've got sort of the piece stuff working. And make this, figure out what exactly, oh wait, sorry, I forgot we moved this out. What we want to do here is, like, when we do these pieces, make this actual routine here work the way we think it should, where we say, let's start a sort key, and this group sorts together, and off we go. I think that's a good idea. So I'm going to basically put a to-do in here for what I want to do next week. And I think it might take a couple of days, but then I think we can finally have all this stuff straightened out. Let's say that this is what needs to happen. So, this is where articulated figures will be happening. So we need to have this code look correct in terms of how we want rendering submitted. It should begin by creating a sort key for the entire armature, and then it should be able to guarantee that each piece will be rendered in the order it was submitted after being sorted into the scene at large by the key, right? And at the same time, I feel like we should also try to make the, well, I guess so. I think we do the pivot points correctly with bitmap alignment here. So that should all be fine, I think. And that means that our displacement, we don't need a displacement or a sort bias, because that can just happen outside now, right? So yeah, this should eliminate the need for render group side source bias as well, since now the user is in control of setting the sort value specifically. this also means we should be able to call a sort key transform routine that does the entity basis transform and then reports the sort key to us. Yeah. And probably we will want the sort keys to be U32s now. So we'll convert from float at this time, and that way we can use the low bits for maintaining order. Or maybe we just use a stable sort. Yeah. So let's see here. I'm gonna go to the Q&A. Canuckles, kind of didn't get it from the email. Are you still up to putting a break sometime soon and make a little intro series programming? Still up to? Did I ever say I was going to do that? I definitely am not going to do that, but I don't recall ever saying I was going to do that either. Another use case to consider for the YZ sorting, flat things laying on top of other flat things, like a rug on a floor. How would the Y sort position be set in this case, especially if the thing on top was larger than the thing it was laying on? Well, I don't think we quite have that situation, but I would say that should be treated the same as the articulated figure case, kind of. But I don't know. I guess I would say if something is lying on the floor, then as long as it is broken up in terms of floor pieces, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think what I would probably do is I would say that its z value should always be a little higher than the other z values, right? But the fact that it's one piece that goes over a lot of them, I'm not sure how you really make that work properly. Canuckles, you wanted to go a bit more serious than introduce you early on. Maybe change your mind since. No, I want to do that someday, but that's like after Handmade Hero's done, right? That's not any time during Handmade Hero. Gary Johansson, what do you think of representing entities as 3D objects to keep things simple, like cylinders for characters and cubes for tiles and rooms? It's not a bad idea, just based on the number of things that's hard to get right with straight 2D bitmaps. I could see using just plates in 3D as being a good idea. Uh, because sorting by Y seems to be really temperamental. And so, I'm really just not sure if maybe there's something to be said for actually just having plates which have a Z value. This is kind of standard in modern games where you have each sprite mapped onto a plate. You actually can still put them in 3D and use a Z buffer to sort them or whatever. And I think that has a lot of niceness to it. And I don't know, maybe we should do that. The idea for Handmade Hero was to try and stay away from having to do a lot of 3D stuff because I feel like that's kind of a jump that's harder for people to make. So I don't know. Like, it may be that this is good enough and then it's okay. It may be that it's not, and then I don't know. Like, maybe you have to do the 3D. Yeah, I'm not sure. The case that we were talking about with the rug is an interesting one because I do think that's problematic, and maybe it's not clear why I think it's problematic, but I'm assuming that the person who asked the question knows why it's problematic because otherwise they wouldn't ask the question. But the problem that we would have with that is that, if you're sorting by Y, then you've got this problem of I've got a rug and then I've got some tiles under the rug. Clearly, none of these tiles should sort in front of the rug, right? Because the rug's on top of them. So I can't very well put the sort for this thing here. And the reason I can't is because if I did, all of these would actually have sort keys that were in front of it. Right? On the other hand, I can't put it here, which is what would allow it to sort in front of all of these, because if I put it here, then a hero who is standing here would sort behind the rug. Right? So I'm just not really sure. I feel like this is the kind of thing where I need to work out more explicitly what would happen in 3D that makes it work okay, and then make sure that that gets reproduced. And I think that the answer is that you need to be interpolating, if that makes some sense. Like, the reason that this works is because I know that it was flat, and so I know that the value from here to here is not increasing, right? Whereas this guy, I know that the value from here to here is increasing in terms of its closeness to the camera. But even that doesn't really answer the question for me. Because at no time are we contemplating a case where these things intersect. So we shouldn't really ever have to consider the fact that they change. They should be able to be represented by something. But I just don't know what that something is. Yeah, I feel like this just needs to be worked out in 3D a little more carefully, right? Um, in 3D we've got the situation where we're looking at this, and if we had something like this, we would know that this is in front of this because the actual time when we encounter it, right? The time when it gets encountered is earlier on this ray than on here, right? If we were to take a look at where these things come on the camera. And I guess that's a good, you can kind of see its incidence here being important. Like as I come down, where this intersects on the camera plane continues to kind of be, it's a line going this way, right? As opposed to a line going that way. And so this does eventually, right, if taken out far enough, get to be in front of this. Same here. So this part of this wall would have been in front of this, but this part of this wall isn't. And so I think that's the important part, is that these planes actually are relevant. Right? And it's tricky because you care about which part of the plane you're talking about. Well, technically the stream is over, so I'm going to have to end. But this, I think we're not done here. I think this is definitely, there's more to this. There's got to be more to it than this, and I think we need to figure out what it is. So I'm not satisfied with my understanding of it, and there's more, we need to go further. Akoto87, maybe you need to sort the objects separately in both Y and Z, and then solve the conflicts if an object A is before another object B in the Y sort, but in the reverse order in the Z sort. That's a very interesting idea. I don't know, again, like I said, I don't feel like I have a complete understanding of it. I'm not sure if it's an idea that attacks the problem in the place that it needs to or not, but it's a very interesting idea. What he's suggesting, or she, whoever Akoto87 is, what they're suggesting is that if we have an object that is in front of somebody both in terms of x, in terms of y, and in terms of z, then presumably it can never be wrong. But if it's in front of it in x, in front of it in y, but behind it in z, then maybe that is the cases that we have to resolve, and maybe we have to resolve them in some special way. Still, though, I don't know. I still think that doesn't really help us. And the reason that I think that doesn't really help us is because part of the problem is that objects don't have just one y value, right? So we'd still have that weird thing of like, do we cheat and place the thing in a different place? I feel like we shouldn't have to be doing that. I'm kind of also wondering if maybe I'm not missing a bigger picture here, which is that I wonder if I was outthinking myself, and actually the z value is the only thing you really care about. I don't know. I'm going to finish the Q&A. We need to spend a whole episode working this out. Well, I don't see any more questions really. So I'm going to go ahead and close down and just say that this is to be continued because I'm not satisfied with it and I think we need to look at it more closely and figure out what actually should be going on here. Because I feel like there's an answer that's just a little bit out of reach because I'm not understanding them right. And I think what I need to do is rather than kind of like get to it roundabout way and be like, oh, let's think about this too today, we need to spend a day and say, we're just going to spend all day today drawing out cases, figuring out what would actually happen in 3D, and then figure out how we correctly capture that in the 2D setting to our satisfaction. So I think that's going to be what needs to happen. So I'm going to go ahead and close down. Thank you everyone for joining me for the episode of Handmade Hero. It's been a pleasure coding with you as always. If you would like to follow along with the stream at home, you can always pre-order the game on handmadehero.org. It comes with a source code, so you can play around with it. We also have a forum site you can go to if you want to ask questions, a Patreon page if you want to support the video series, a schedule bot that tweets the schedule at you, and an episode guide if you want to catch up on old episodes. That's about it for today. I will catch you guys next week. There's no stream tomorrow. So until next week, have fun programming, and I will see you guys on the internet. Take it easy, everyone.